Carl Jung documented something in his private case files that psychiatrists today still refuse to acknowledge. He discovered empaths who defied every prediction about their psychological breaking point. These weren't the empaths who snapped into rage or collapsed into depression. These were individuals who absorbed decades of abuse, manipulation, and betrayal, yet emerged not broken, but forged into something psychology had never categorized. Jung called them the unbreakable ones, and he believed they represented the next phase of human psychological evolution. What terrified Jung wasn't their resilience, it was what happened to the people who tried to break them. Today I'm revealing Jung's prophecy about empaths who refused to break, and why he believed these individuals would eventually reshape human consciousness itself. This isn't about surviving abuse. This is about transcending the entire framework that creates victims and predators in the first place. Jung's prophecy began with an observation that contradicted everything mainstream psychology believed about trauma response. In 1917, during the chaos of World War I, Jung treated soldiers returning from the trenches with what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. But among these traumatized men, Jung noticed a pattern that didn't fit existing psychological models. Certain individuals, usually those described by their fellow soldiers as unusually sensitive or empathic, showed a completely different response to sustained horror. While others developed the expected symptoms of psychological fragmentation, these empaths seemed to undergo what Jung called psychological crystallization. They didn't break under pressure. They became more coherent, more integrated, more psychologically whole. Jung wrote in his private notes, "I have observed individuals who absorb trauma that should destroy them, yet emerge with a quality of presence that can only be described as luminous. They have touched something in the depths of suffering that transforms rather than destroys." This observation haunted Jung for the rest of his life because it suggested that empathic sensitivity wasn't the vulnerability everyone assumed it was. It was a psychological structure, capable of withstanding pressures that would shatter more defended personalities. Jung began systematically studying what differentiated empaths who broke from empaths who crystallized under pressure. He identified what he called the refusal mechanism, a psychological process where certain empaths unconsciously refuse to accept the narrative that they should be destroyed by what they've experienced. This wasn't denial. Jung was clear about that. These individuals felt everything, processed everything, integrated everything, but somewhere in their psychological core existed what Jung described as an unshakable knowing that their essence could not be touched by external events, no matter how devastating. Jung documented case after case. The woman who survived childhood abuse so severe that Jung initially couldn't comprehend how she remained sane. The man who lost everything in the war, his family, his health, his future, yet maintained what Jung called conscious compassion. The empath who absorbed years of narcissistic manipulation, yet emerged with their capacity for love not only intact, but somehow deepened. What these individuals shared wasn't toughness or emotional armor. They possessed what Jung termed transparent resilience. They remained open, vulnerable, feeling everything, yet something in their psychological architecture prevented external darkness from contaminating their internal essence. Modern neuroscience is finally beginning to validate what Jung observed a century ago. Dr. Richard Davidson's research at the University of Wisconsin shows that certain individuals demonstrate extraordinary resilience not through emotional suppression, but through what he calls affective flexibility. Their brains can experience intense emotional states while maintaining activity in regions associated with meta-awareness and psychological integration. They feel everything without being defined by anything. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk's research on trauma reveals something even more remarkable. Some individuals process traumatic experiences through what he calls integrative healing rather than defensive fragmentation. Instead of splitting off traumatic memories to protect the psyche, they somehow metabolize trauma in real time, transforming it into psychological depth rather than psychological damage. This is exactly what Jung observed in his unbreakable empaths. They weren't avoiding pain. They were transmuting it through a psychological process Jung believed was connected to what he called the self, the deep center of personality that transcends ego identification. Jung's prophecy wasn't just about individual empaths surviving trauma. He believed these unbreakable empaths represented an evolutionary development in human consciousness itself. In his later writings, particularly in his work on synchronicity and the collective unconscious, Jung suggested that humanity was undergoing a psychological transformation. He believed that empaths who refused to break were unconscious participants in this collective evolution. Jung wrote, "The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe, but certain individuals are born with a psychological structure that serves a transpersonal purpose. They absorb collective shadow material not as victims but as alchemical vessels, transforming collective darkness into individual light. This is why Jung called them prophetic, not because they predicted the future, but because they embodied the future psychological capacities that humanity would need to develop." Jung identified 3 core characteristics that defined empaths who refuse to break, characteristics that set them apart from both normal empaths and the general population. The first characteristic Jung called ontological security. This wasn't confidence or self-esteem in the conventional sense. It was a bone-deep knowing that their essential being existed independent of external validation or attack. Jung observed that unbreakable empaths possessed an unusual relationship with their own existence. While most people derive their sense of self from achievements, relationships, or social roles, these empaths seem to draw their identity from something deeper. Jung called it participation in being itself. They experienced themselves not primarily as separate individuals struggling for survival, but as expressions of a larger consciousness temporarily inhabiting individual form. This wasn't a belief system or spiritual philosophy. Jung was clear about this. It was a direct experiential knowing that emerged from their psychological structure. When Jung asked these patients about their sense of self, they struggled to articulate it. One patient told him, "I know that whatever happens to me, it happens to my life circumstances, my body, my emotions, even my thoughts. But there's something in me that watches all of this that can never be touched." Jung recognized this as what Eastern philosophies call witness consciousness, but he observed it emerging spontaneously in empaths who had never studied spiritual traditions. This ontological security created what Jung termed psychological invulnerability. Not because nothing could hurt them, everything hurt them, but because no external event could shake their fundamental knowing of who they were beneath all experience. The second characteristic Jung identified was what he called compassionate discernment. Unbreakable empaths didn't lose their empathic abilities under pressure. Instead, their empathy evolved into something more sophisticated. Jung observed that normal empaths often struggle to distinguish between empathy and enmeshment. They feel others' emotions so intensely that they lose track of where others end and they begin. This makes them vulnerable to manipulation and exploitation. But empaths who refused to break developed what Jung described as differentiated compassion. They could feel everything without absorbing anything. They could sense others' pain without taking responsibility for healing it. They could love deeply without needing to fix or save. Jung wrote, "The unbreakable empath maintains complete openness to others' experience while simultaneously maintaining complete clarity about their own boundaries. This combination is rare and extraordinarily powerful." This compassionate discernment allowed them to see manipulation coming from miles away, yet respond to it without defensiveness or counterattack. They simply saw it, understood it, and chose not to participate in it. Jung observed that people attempting to manipulate these empaths often felt deeply confused. Their usual tactics didn't work, not because the empath was defended against them, but because the empath saw through them so clearly that there was nothing to manipulate. The empath's transparency made manipulation impossible. You cannot hook someone who isn't playing the game. The third characteristic Jung identified was the most mysterious and the most crucial to his prophecy. He called it autonomous transformation capacity. Unbreakable empaths possess the ability to transform psychological poison into psychological medicine without conscious effort. Jung spent years trying to understand this mechanism. He eventually concluded it was connected to what he termed the transcendent function, the psyche's natural ability to synthesize opposites into something new. Normal psychological processing works through integration. You experience something difficult. You process it consciously or unconsciously, and eventually you integrate it into your self-concept. But Jung observed that unbreakable empaths operated through a different mechanism. They didn't just integrate difficult experiences, they alchemized them. Trauma that should have created bitterness somehow generated compassion. Betrayal that should have created cynicism somehow deepened their capacity for trust. Abuse that should have created victimhood somehow forged unshakable strength. Jung called this the alchemy of consciousness. Just as medieval alchemists believed they could transform lead into gold, Jung believed certain psychological structures could transform darkness into light through processes that operated below conscious awareness. The unbreakable empath didn't choose this transformation. It happened through them as a natural function of their psychological architecture. Jung documented how this transformation process manifested in his patients' lives. One patient described experiencing severe emotional abuse from a family member. Instead of developing the expected trauma response, she reported that each incident of abuse seemed to clarify something about human psychology for her. She found herself understanding not just her abuser, but the collective patterns that create abusers in the first place. The abuse didn't break her. It educated her in the mechanics of human suffering at a level she couldn't have accessed through normal experience. Another patient survived a betrayal so profound that Jung initially expected complete psychological collapse. Instead, the patient reported experiencing what he called an awakening. The betrayal shattered his illusions about human relationships so completely that he was forced to build a new understanding based on reality rather than projection. He told Jung, "The betrayal was the best thing that ever happened to me because it destroyed my capacity for self-deception. Now I see clearly, and clear seeing is the greatest gift imaginable, even though it came through devastation." Jung observed that unbreakable empaths often reported similar experiences. Trauma forced them to confront reality so directly that they could no longer maintain comfortable illusions. This created what Jung called psychological nakedness. No defenses, no denial, no comfortable stories, just raw contact with what is. Most people avoid this nakedness at all costs, but unbreakable empaths seemed to move toward it. They instinctively understood that psychological truth, no matter how painful, was preferable to comfortable delusion. This preference for truth over comfort created their unbreakable quality. You cannot break someone whose relationship with reality is already more honest than any attack could force them to acknowledge. Jung's prophecy about these empaths wasn't optimistic in the conventional sense. He didn't believe their emergence meant humanity was naturally progressing toward enlightenment. Instead, Jung believed that increasing collective unconsciousness and cultural fragmentation would create the conditions that forced certain empaths to develop unbreakable qualities simply to survive. He wrote in his later years, "Humanity is facing a psychological crisis of unprecedented magnitude. The old systems of meaning are collapsing. The collective shadow grows darker with each generation that refuses to look at it. In such times, individuals capable of transforming darkness into light become essential for species survival, not because they save humanity, but because they demonstrate that transformation is possible." Jung believed unbreakable empaths were emerging not as saviors, but as living proof that human consciousness could evolve beyond victim-predator dynamics. They represented what he called the individuated human, someone who had achieved psychological wholeness, not through avoiding darkness, but by transforming it consciously. The prophecy wasn't that these empaths would fix the world. The prophecy was that their existence would prove that consciousness evolution was real and demonstrate the specific psychological capacities humanity needed to develop collectively. Jung observed that unbreakable empaths naturally moved through what he identified as 3 distinct phases of development. Understanding these phases is crucial because they reveal why some empaths crystallize under pressure while others fragment. The first phase Jung called unconscious absorption. This is where all empaths begin. They feel everything, absorb everything, and have no conscious awareness that they're processing others' psychological material. During this phase, the empath genuinely believes that all the emotions flooding through them are their own. They feel responsible for others' happiness because they literally experience others' unhappiness as if it were happening inside them. Jung observed that empaths can remain in this phase for decades, even entire lifetimes. They become what he called psychological sponges, soaking up collective shadow material without any protective awareness. Most empaths who break do so while trapped in this phase, They absorb more darkness than their system can process, and eventually they fragment under the accumulated weight of unmetabolized pain. The second phase Jung termed conscious recognition. Something happens, usually a betrayal or crisis so severe it cannot be rationalized away, that forces the empath to recognize they've been absorbing content that doesn't belong to them. This recognition often feels like awakening from a decades-long dream. One of Jung's patients described it as suddenly realizing she'd been carrying bags of garbage that other people had handed her throughout her life, bags she'd accepted without question, because she assumed that's what caring people do. Jung observed that this recognition phase is extraordinarily painful. The empath must confront how much of their identity was constructed from absorbed material rather than authentic self-knowing. They realize that many relationships were built on their unconscious willingness to absorb and process others' shadows. This recognition can feel like psychological death because so much of what the empath believed was them turns out to be everyone else. Jung wrote that this phase separates empaths who will become unbreakable from those who will remain wounded. The crucial variable is whether the empath responds to this recognition with self-rejection or self-compassion. Those who judge themselves for having been unconscious tend to develop new psychological defenses. They swing from being too open to being too closed, from absorbing everything to shutting everything out. But those who meet their unconscious participation with compassion, who understand they were doing the best they could with the awareness they had, these empaths move into the third phase that creates unbreakability. The third phase Jung called integrated participation. The empath maintains their sensitivity but develops conscious boundaries. They can feel everything without absorbing anything. They remain open but no longer merge with others' psychological content. Jung observed that empaths in this phase possess extraordinary psychological capacities. They can walk into a room and immediately sense the emotional atmosphere, but they're no longer contaminated by it. They can love someone deeply while clearly seeing that person's dysfunction, and they can hold both realities simultaneously without trying to fix or save. They can offer genuine compassion without taking responsibility for others' healing. Most remarkably, Jung observed that integrated empaths develop what he called psychological immunity. Just as physical immunity allows the body to encounter pathogens without becoming infected, psychological immunity allows these empaths to encounter manipulation, projection, and abuse without being damaged by it. This isn't numbness or defense. Jung was emphatic about this distinction. Integrated empaths feel everything perhaps even more deeply than before, but they've developed the psychological structure to process and transform dark content without being destroyed by it. Jung believed this integration represented the evolutionary capacity that humanity needed to develop collectively. If humans could learn to remain open and feeling while maintaining clear boundaries and conscious awareness, most psychological suffering would dissolve naturally. Jung documented specific behavioral patterns that indicated an empath had achieved unbreakability. These weren't things the empath consciously did. They were natural expressions of integrated psychological structure. First, unbreakable empaths stopped explaining themselves. Jung noticed they no longer felt compelled to justify their perceptions, defend their boundaries, or convince others of their worth. They stated their truth clearly and then allowed others to respond however they needed to respond. If someone misunderstood them, they might clarify once, but they didn't engage in the endless explaining that characterizes unconscious empaths desperate for validation. Second, these empaths demonstrated what Jung called affectionate detachment. They genuinely cared about people while remaining completely detached from outcomes. They could offer help without needing to be the one who helped. They could share wisdom without needing others to accept it. They could love someone while accepting that person might never love them back. This combination of deep care and complete non-attachment mystified Jung initially. It seemed paradoxical that someone could care so deeply while being so unattached, but he eventually understood that true love and attachment are different things. Attachment needs something from the other person. Love simply recognizes and honors their being. Third, unbreakable empaths exhibited what Jung termed transparent authority. They didn't try to prove their worth or establish their credibility. They simply inhabited their knowing so completely that others instinctively recognized it. Jung observed that when these empaths spoke, even about challenging topics, people listened differently. There was a quality of truth that transmitted beyond the words themselves. Fourth, They maintained what Jung called conscious innocence. Despite everything they'd experienced and everything they now saw clearly about human psychology, they retained a quality of openness and wonder that Jung associated with childhood. But this wasn't naive innocence born from ignorance. It was conscious innocence born from understanding. They'd seen the worst of humanity and integrated it so completely that it no longer contaminated their basic trust in existence itself. Fifth, unbreakable empaths displayed unusual reactions to attack or manipulation. Instead of defending themselves or counterattacking, they often responded with what Jung called ontological curiosity. They seemed genuinely interested in understanding why someone felt compelled to attack them. This wasn't a therapeutic technique or psychological manipulation. Jung observed it was authentic interest in the psychological mechanisms creating the attack. This response completely disarmed most attackers because there was nothing to fight against. You cannot wound someone who meets your attack with curious compassion. Jung documented several cases that illustrated these patterns in action. One patient, a woman who'd survived decades of narcissistic abuse from family members, finally achieved integration after years of inner work. Jung watched how her family responded to her transformation. Initially, they escalated their manipulation attempts, sensing that their old tactics weren't working. They tried guilt, they tried rage, they tried playing victim, they tried recruiting other family members against her, but nothing penetrated her psychological immunity. She remained loving, clear, and completely unmoved by their dysfunction. Jung observed that within 6 months, her family relationships completely reorganized. Some family members, threatened by her clarity, withdrew completely. Others, inspired by her example, began their own psychological work. A few simply accepted the new dynamic and learned to relate to her authentically for the first time. The patient herself remained peaceful throughout this reorganization. She told Jung she finally understood that she couldn't control how others responded to her authenticity. She could only control whether she remained true to herself. This acceptance, Jung noted, represented complete psychological maturity. Another patient, a man who'd spent his career absorbing workplace dysfunction, finally integrated after a health crisis, forced him to examine his patterns. When he returned to work, Jung documented the remarkable changes. His colleagues initially tested his new boundaries, expecting him to revert to his old role as emotional shock absorber for the organization. But he maintained his integrated state with what Jung called relaxed firmness. He remained friendly and collaborative, but refused to absorb others' stress or take responsibility for problems he didn't create. Jung observed that within months, the entire workplace dynamic shifted. Some colleagues, unable to function without someone to dump on, left the organization. Others rose to the occasion and became more responsible. The patient told Jung he hadn't tried to change anyone. He'd simply stopped participating in dysfunctional patterns, and the system naturally reorganized around his new way of being. Jung's prophecy extended beyond individual empaths to their collective impact on human consciousness. He believed that each empath who achieved unbreakability contributed to what he called the collective individuation process. Just as individual humans must individuate to become whole, Jung believed humanity as a species must undergo collective individuation to survive and evolve. He saw unbreakable empaths as early participants in this collective process. They were developing psychological capacities that the entire species would eventually need to cultivate. Jung wrote that humanity faced a choice between conscious evolution and unconscious destruction. If enough individuals achieved psychological integration, they would create what he called a morphogenetic field of consciousness that would make integration easier for others. But if collective unconsciousness continued to deepen, humanity would face increasingly severe crises until forced to wake up or perish. Unbreakable empaths represented the former possibility, living proof that humans could evolve beyond tribal consciousness into genuine individuation while maintaining loving connection with others. Jung identified what he believed was the ultimate purpose of unbreakable empaths. They weren't meant to save humanity or fix collective problems. Their purpose was simply to exist as demonstrations of what's possible. Every person who encountered an integrated empath received a transmission beyond words. They witnessed someone who felt everything yet remained unbroken, someone who saw clearly yet remained compassionate, someone who'd been through hell yet emanated peace. This transmission operated through what Jung called participation mystique, the unconscious connection between all human psyches. When someone encountered a genuinely integrated person, something in their own psyche recognized that integration as possible for them too. This wasn't inspiration in the conventional sense. It was a direct knowing, transmitted from one nervous system to another, that psychological wholeness was achievable. Jung believed this transmission was more powerful than any teaching or therapy because it bypassed conscious resistance and skepticism. The integrated person's mere presence activated latent integration capacities in others. Jung also warned about shadow aspects that unbreakable empaths must remain conscious of. He observed that psychological invulnerability could become spiritual bypassing if empaths weren't careful. Some integrated empaths developed subtle superiority, looking down on those still trapped in unconscious patterns. Others used their immunity as a weapon, remaining calm during conflicts in ways that shamed or manipulated others. Still others withdrew too completely, using their integration as justification for avoiding meaningful engagement with collective problems. Jung emphasized that true integration includes integration of shadow. The unbreakable empath must remain conscious that their strength could become arrogance, their clarity could become judgment, their immunity could become coldness. Ongoing shadow work wasn't optional. It was essential for maintaining authentic integration. Jung wrote that the individuated person never stops working on themselves because consciousness itself is infinite. There's always deeper integration available, always more shadow to acknowledge, always more wholeness to embody. Jung's prophecy concludes with a vision that remains startlingly relevant today. He believed humanity was entering what he called the age of the individual, a period when collective identifications would dissolve and force people into authentic selfhood. This transition would be catastrophic for those identified with collective structures, comforting for those who'd achieved psychological autonomy. Unbreakable empaths would serve as guides during this transition, not through teaching or leading, but simply by existing as examples of integrated humanity. They would demonstrate that it's possible to survive the death of collective meaning structures and discover authentic individual meaning. They would show that sensitivity need not be weakness, that feeling deeply doesn't require breaking, that openness and boundaries can coexist, that consciousness evolution isn't mystical fantasy, but practical psychological development accessible to anyone willing to do the inner work. Your refusal to break isn't stubbornness, and it isn't denial. Jung would recognize it as your psyche's instinctive knowing that your essence transcends anything that happens to you. Every empath carries within them the potential for this unbreakability. The question isn't whether you have this capacity, but whether you'll trust it enough to stop defending against your own depth. You've absorbed enough darkness to destroy a dozen ordinary people, yet here you are, reading these words, still feeling, still open, still capable of love. That's not survival, that's transformation in action. The alchemical process Jung spent his life documenting. Your sensitivity was never your weakness, it was your evolutionary advantage, the psychological structure that allows you to metabolize collective shadow and transmute it into individual light. Drop a comment right now with these words, "I transform darkness into light," because speaking this truth activates the psychological capacity Jung believed was dormant in all empaths waiting for conscious recognition. Write it now. Claim what you've always been, an alchemical vessel for consciousness transformation. The like button below this video isn't just engagement. Pressing it right now is you acknowledging your own unbreakable nature, and subscribing means you're ready to continue this journey into psychological territories most people never explore. Your participation in this community creates the morphogenetic field Jung predicted. Every integrated empath making integration more accessible for empaths still struggling in unconscious absorption. What I'm preparing to reveal next goes even deeper into psychological mechanisms that Jung discovered but never published during his lifetime. Knowledge about consciousness capacities so advanced they sound impossible until you experience them directly in your own awareness, content that will fundamentally alter how you understand your relationship with reality itself. Stay connected, because what's coming will complete what Jung started. The full map of empathic transformation from unconscious victim to conscious vessel of evolutionary change. See you in the next dimension, where we continue exploring the depths of what you're becoming.